Now, what we're going to be monitoring here is a few things here. One is stress. So as you guys probably know, or for those that don't know, I'll go a little bit about that. Stress is what we consider here is this red and orange. So this stuff over here, red and orange. So that means really is those red is heavy stress and severely affecting the crop health or potentially the health of the orchard over time. Orange is mildly affecting it, so it's something that you want to avoid. Yellow is not stress. Yellow is something that just kind of to alert you that the tree is starting to work a bit harder, and that could be for a number of different reasons, but it's really an alert. It's the same thing like for a stoplight. Think of it that way. Light green, of course, is optimal. It's working, but it's not working too hard. And then you've got dark green as well. So really during this period that I'm referring to here, what we need to do is avoid oranges and reds, and especially consecutive days of those oranges and reds. But also at the same time, let's avoid dark greens as usually a sign of over irrigation or over watering. So those are the things that we want to make sure that we're monitoring in this period here. Another thing too is to be cognizant of the weather forecast and then the ETO forecast. And what's great about it, you can just hover over in the overview there to look at what the forecast is going to be, look at what the weather is going to be. We also have in the planner, which is awesome, a forecast, 10 days out. Okay. This is extremely helpful. SEMA stations that we're all familiar with, they give you what happened that day. They're not really giving you any type of forecast. We're actually able to give you a forecast, and with that, you can adjust your watering schedule. So it's highly useful. I really recommend that when you guys are scheduling irrigation, really look at what is coming up and when those heat waves are coming. Last thing that I really want to bring your attention to is the MDS. And again, for people that aren't familiar with it, or maybe that people just are new completely, MDS stands for maximum daily shrinkage. So what that is the trunk actually shrinking and shrinking more and more. So this happens as the sun comes up, and it continues throughout the day until the sun goes down. It's going through its transpiration. It's going through photosynthesis. This is where the tree is actually shrinking to pull water and nutrients up from the root zone. So this is what we are really measuring here, and really a heavy indicator of stress. And this actually is what helps show you those colors. So when you're seeing a gradual increase in MDS, like here as you guys can see, 65, 75, 130, 200, 283. This is an indication you can be looking at around 130 when you get that yellow and say, there probably needs to be some type of action taken. So there's three things we want to monitor during this period of time, April to June. Now, during this time, what to consider, okay? So this stuff is happening. What we want to do is we want to consider irrigation. So more frequent irrigations will help maintain certain MDS and growth when weather's consistent. So it also helps with standing water levels and things like alternaria. So I give an example here. Grower here did a longer set. This is about, I think, 36-hour set. It maintains for a long period of time. You have green, 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 and then suddenly, finally, it runs out of its carbohydrate reserve. You get this instant stress of red. There's a lot of triple digit heats and it drops down. This is what you want to avoid, this consecutive days on also this negative growth, okay? Grower makes an adjustment, goes to small multiple sets, applying really the same amount of water, but still has that upward growth there. Now he only had 2 orange days in that, but he applied water on that second orange day, so he was making an adjustment there. This is what we want to see. We don't want to see this long periods of negative growth, long stress days, okay? So we want to see if you just 1 or 2, that's okay. You're making an adjustment. So of course, if there are irrigation constraints, because we don't know that, right? We don't know what constraints you guys have. I know some of the growers that I work with, they have to let the irrigation district know 5 days in advance sometimes for getting water. Now I know that this year it looks like we're getting no water, right? 5% allocation rate. We're running wells and stuff like that. But generally, if you are constrained in your water, use the MDS for sure, or use the weather. as a preventative rather than a reactive measure. Okay, so if you're starting to see stress, it might be too late if you're having to, submit water orders 3 or 4 days in advance. Try to really anticipate when it comes to the weather and what you're seeing on NBS trends. So then finally, why do this at all? What is the point of not making sure that we have these long periods of stress? It's very simple. This is the time where you're getting kernel weight. Just like humans, trees will use the path of least resistance, right? So instead of pulling from the deeper root zones, 3 or 4 feet down, if there's moisture available in the nuts, which there is during this period, the gooey center, they will start pulling from that. And this is directly affecting your net crop load. This is directly affecting your bottom line. This is why it's vitally important to avoid these types of things in this period. Okay. All right. Pop this up. Okay. Some exceptions to this area here. There's heat waves and heavy crop loads. Okay. So during this time frame here, just like trees, or just gonna be just like humans, just like us, trees must climatize. And you guys have probably seen that. We've had a little bit of heat in the past couple of weeks. We're going to be having heat coming up here. This is really, you'll see this a lot happen, that they'll jump into stress here. And I give another example. They had low temperatures here, first heat wave hit, high stress even with water. You can actually, I don't know if you guys can see this, there's actually more water applied here, about 15%, 20% more in this June 3rd to 9th time frame. It still went into stress. You still had about 3 days or so of stress there. Now you look at the second heat wave, it's actually sustained even longer than the first heat wave, but you notice it's climatized. And then it can actually secondarily be looked at if you're looking at the soil moisture. It's actually increasing. The tree's not having this panic attack. It's not trying to pull up water. It's finally climatized. So typically you'll see that with that, and this is almost without fail if you have a heavy crop load. So what I've been telling a lot of my growers that I've talked to is the ones you guys are seeing right now that are showing those oranges and reds, they seem to stress quickly. This is usually an indication that they're holding a pretty heavy crop load. So that means those ones are the ones you want to look at for the rest of the year and make sure you're getting the water on that they need. So just keep that in mind when you see this stuff. If you see a heat wave coming, don't panic. Sometimes this is just going to happen, especially if you've got a heavy crop load. Okay, so the second period is this pre-harvest period. This is really, I say, a mid-June to up until harvest. So this period here. What to monitor in this period? Stress. Now, if you remember the last time I said stress, I said avoid it. This one's do your best to avoid it, right? The first one was a command. This one's more try your hardest, because in all reality, if you do have a crop load, if you actually have something on the tree, you're going to see colors. It's a fact. And this is actually a good thing. It means that the tree is working. It has something to work for. But what we're trying to avoid here is consecutive days of that. Okay. This is an example of actually my ranch a few years ago. We had fan jets running, and then we had an alternary issue there, so we had to switch to drip. Okay, so we switched to drip. Well, what did that cause? The root flush and everything was used to that fan jet. So when I switched to drip, you have a couple of days of stress. So we don't really want to see this. I didn't really have a choice in this period because of the alternaria, but it's a good example nonetheless. So there's a lot of stress there that we want to avoid. And the second thing again is MDS, just like last time, but this one's more of maintaining MDS, and you can use it for monitoring for deficit irrigation. So you'll have a lot of up and downs in this area in this time frame because of generally the crop load and the heavy heat. So the trees are really working at this time to maintain themselves. But what we need to do is, if you see this line over this 2-week period, you don't really have any growth, but you really don't have any negative growth. It's just maintained. So this is what we actually want to do. We want to just maintain the growth there. We don't want to have this downward trend, and we don't necessarily want to have upward trend. I've told my growers that I had a ranch in which I kept green all year long, and I thought I did great. I was like, this is awesome. Well, what ended up happening? I just put a ton of growth on the top of the tree. We had to top it the next year. And when it came to harvest, I realized I had no crop. There was nothing on it. So having some color in this time frame, this is actually what you want to see. And you want to have this maintained NBS. So the straight line NBS. Last thing, is I kind of touched on this, is avoiding those consecutive days of negative growth, which, as you can see here, the stress, a couple of days there, we want to avoid as much as we can that area. And this ended up being the reason for this color is a 4,300 pound plus crop load on these particular trees themselves. So it was a very heavy crop for this, and it was really, really working hard. That's why you saw the color. So what to consider during this period? Frequency and timing of irrigation. It does come back to irrigation again, but now it's a little bit different. Frequency and the timing of the irrigation. So it's extremely important to meet that tree's daily demand, but not to flood it out. Okay. The theory sometimes the want is to, well, I see these colors, I've got to get it back into the green. I've got to get it there, and I got to maintain it there. Not necessarily. Okay. And this is the tricky part of this. So when you have high stress days or high temperature spikes, this can really pop up the trees into a stress. So trying to time again the weather patterns there. But also we want to avoid these long sets, because what happens during this time frame is humidity levels increase because of standing water. We just don't want to have that. Okay. Too much of that water can cause hole rot and then create stick tights. Okay. So there's a reason we kind of wanted to avoid that, and we've kind of pushed everyone towards doing more frequent irrigations as opposed to just longer sets. So there's a lot of, here's an example too. Grower here did a lot of long sets. These are 24-hour runs. And as you can see, it was yellow and orange, and then he finally got to green and a little red for a second, but then back to green, just back to back irrigations. This may look good, but in reality, it's doing the same thing as you guys saw on the slide before. He's still maintaining that MDS. So this is actually kind of what we want, but it's actually less movement. And what actually ended up happening is alternaria issues were exacerbated here. They were very, very bad because of the standing water level, because of so much water. So in the long run, this is not the greatest thing you want to do during this time frame. You want to actually see some color. You actually want to see it working. One of the ranches that we oversaw, we kept it basically in yellow from mid-June to harvest, and that was fine. It was healthy. It was just working hard. We were doing, like I said, our best to avoid consecutive oranges and reds. Okay. But we also just couldn't bring it up to the green level, because if we did, we would have a lot of standing water. Okay. So why is this going to help? Kind of touched on a little bit. You guys can kind of guess here of why this would help. Disease and harvest issues. Okay. Standing water is really the worst thing at this time of year to have out in the orchards. They just thrive with this stuff. You can also lose, especially with fan jet. I was talking with Blake Sandin. He did, some of the ETC values here in the South Valley for us. You can lose up to 25% to evaporation with standing water, and then just having fan jets running for that long period of time. This is very inefficient. We don't want to be doing that. So shorter sets are much better, and they cut back on these disease issues here. So some exceptions to this: deficit irrigation and stress before shaking. So what's proven to be most effective is purposely deficit irrigating to help the issue of combating the issue of stick tights. So we know that that's a fact. You can really make sure that you're not over irrigating or and you're purposely deficit. You can save some water at this point in the season. Nut fills over, so you're not having to worry about the nuts losing this moisture. But I mean, to an extent there, if it does have a lot of stress days, you can still harm that crop. Another thing that we found that's been quite, one of our growers has found this, we call it the Brian Paula method here, is 2 to 4 days of reds with making sure that you actually have negative trends. So for the first time, I'm actually saying to make sure you actually have a negative growth pattern. 2 to 4 days right before you harvest. If you can see here, he harvested here. He took the trees off, or excuse me, took the dendrometers off and shook the trees this date. He had 3 days of reds. He actually had some negative growth. The reason you want to see some reds and negative growth on this part right before harvest is this helps with barking. Okay, so that issue there with the moisture in the bark, if you actually are seeing that decrease of negative growth as we're talking about, that means the moisture is leaving the bark. So this will really help combat that. It really help combat the barking issues here. So 2 to 4 days right before shaking. This has been very helpful in combating that issue. Okay. All right. The last frame here is that I want to talk about is the post-harvest. So this is dependent upon variety. So what are we monitoring? You guys will notice a trend here. Again, we're going with stress. Make sure to get the dendrometers back on the trees and push to green ASAP. And I'll go over that in a second. Water, make sure water is getting on as soon as possible. Growth, get the tree on an upward trend, again, as soon as possible. So this grower here, they shook here, they left on the ground here, they applied some water. And I want to point out here, this is actual growth here. It's like, well, how is that possible? The trees, and I may be getting ahead of myself here, but the trees here, which have a drastic decrease in water demand. There are no nuts on the tree, okay? So when they come off, there's no nuts. There is a drastic decrease for water demand. So this little bit of water will shoot that growth up. And this is actually what we're wanting. So this can't, what I highly, highly recommend is as soon as you shake, do your best to get water back on. Our tactic was we shook the tree, we swept it into a windrow, and we put water back on. We would run the drip, we'd run the fan jet. Now for fan jet, a tactic that we use, if we had a 2-set system, maybe got an east and west set, I would turn the whole system on at one time. And put low pressure on the fan jets, it'd basically be bubbling out. And what we would do, we had 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. We got 4 hours on. Trees are happy with that. They responded well because there was a drastic decrease in that water demand. So if you can, I highly recommend putting water on and getting to this trend. This is what you're trying to shoot for. You want to have some upward mobility. You want to get it back into some green, get in the yellow, get in the green, start getting some growth back on the tree. And there's a reason for this. This is probably one of the most crucial times of the year. The reason for this is because during this time frame, this is where next year's crop is being set. Getting growth back on the tree is key to loading up for next year. This is where bud differential is happening. You need to have the tree in this positive growth trend in order to get helping out for next year's crop. So this is extremely important. I know it's a headache. It was a headache for us, especially you're battling the harvest crews the whole time, right? You're trying to like, no, I need to get water on. I need to get water on. It will pay dividends though by doing this. Okay. So really the recap here is for nut fill, avoid stress, but don't go to dark green. So don't overwater. This is the period we're in now. So this is what we all need to be thinking about. When it comes to pre-harvest, so when it comes to around middle of June, avoid that heavy stress, avoid the heavy watering, and also avoid that negative downward growth. You just want to be able to make sure that you're maintaining everything. And post-harvest, get the trees to the green as soon as possible and get them growing. This is for next year's crop, okay? So doing these things, we were able to increase yields every year for 3 years going. Over that time, over 3 years, on average, we increased about 15% on our yields. Now, there's a little bit every year, right? But overall, 15% over that 3-year period. It was because of these three things. It's going to increase the health of your orchard. It's going to increase, like if you're monitoring and making sure you're not getting that stress there, you're going to maximize that crop for this year, okay? So doing these three things will, over time, increase and help you guys with healthier orchards and better yields. So that's the presentation. I appreciate you guys coming. I'm going to give it back to Joseph here so he can wrap this up.
Hey, Mark, thanks. That was great. So actually, at the moment, it looks like you guys have all been pretty quiet. I don't see any questions. So I have some questions for Mark. During this time, again, guys, you're welcome to raise your hand. You're welcome to drop your own questions in the chat. I would appreciate anything you guys have to ask, but I've heard a few things you guys consistently ask me. And so I'm gonna get those out of the way with Mark. Mark, first off, something I hear consistently about is deep moisture, especially in the early bit of the season. I hear a lot of guys talking about, well, what about my deep moisture? I need that deep moisture. Can you tell us a little bit about how deep moisture does or doesn't play in to that nut fill period at the beginning of the season? Yeah,
thanks, Joseph. So the deep moisture is crucial, especially when establishing an orchard. What you're trying to do for a young orchard is pushing that moisture down continually, so that way the roots have something to grab and they continually grow and grow and grow. as the tree is now getting into a mature stage, what you're wanting to do during the nut fill period though is keep that top 18 inches. Really, that's where your root flush is always going here. You want to make sure that top 18 inches has enough water. Because if it has to go seek water deeper, which it can, because you've pushed roots down there farther, it's going to see that stress. So those MDS numbers that we were talking about, that's the tree having to push deeper and deeper, right? We want to avoid it from going that deep, and we want to actually just make sure that we're getting those top 18 inches. So in reality, the deep moisture isn't as important during this period as it will be, as it is in more of establishing the orchard stage. That answered.
No, that's real good. And actually, we did a question in the chat, which I think is a really good question, but I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. Specifically, it's asking, do the same concepts apply for pecan orchards? I'd like to get your input on how much this applies to other crops and maybe other crops where you feel like there are distinct differences.
Typically, the nut trees like pecans, pistachios, it's the same type of it's the same principles that are applied here, because both of these types of trees, they all have a nut fill period, right? So these principles can be applied. They just differ. There's different periods of time frame. For example, say like pistachios or pecans, they usually grow with the shell first and then have the nut fill. So it's a bit different than as opposed to almonds, which grow everything at one time, right? So there's actually a longer period of time for almonds as opposed to these other crops. However, you can still apply those to those periods, those types of crops as well. Generally, again, these trees, they act the same. There's a lot of principles that can be applied everywhere. So figuring out one type of crop can really help you, figure out these other types of crops too.
Yeah, guys, don't forget, almonds are actually a part of the peach family, weirdly enough, as much as we consider them a snack nut. But something I want to throw on in addition with what Mark just said is that is why we have the CSM team that we do, where you have someone in your region who's worked with your crops, potentially your fields for multiple years. If you have questions about how these principles can either be directly applied or, reworked or rethought just a little bit to get the exact match for what you're farming, reach out to them, call Chris, call Gilbert. They would be more than happy to have that conversation with you and figure out how they can best kind of take these core concepts, because a lot of these core principles are the same, but match them to your fields. Now you've just got another question. Let's see what we got here. Okay, what exactly is the difference between MDS and growth, Mark? What's the kind of distinction between the two of them? And also, if you could extrapolate a little bit about how they play into our system in their own unique ways.
Okay. So MDS is the maximum daily shrinkage. So that number, and if you guys are ever forget anything that I'm saying here, we have on the overview website, if you actually mouse over to where it says MDS and growth, there's a little question mark there. It can actually tell you how those numbers are calculated. But MDS is basically the daily shrinkage, so how much it contracts for that day. So you have the peak and then the valley, right? So you'll see that as you guys go through that up and down, up and down. If I can go back here, I guess on my slide here. So this peak and this valley here. Now growth is basically midnight to midnight is what we're measuring. So if it actually ends up recovering more than it did the day prior, then you actually that's considered growth. So there's a correlation there between the MDS and growth. If you have heavy MDS and then you have your growth that comes up, but it doesn't actually go higher than the previous day, that's where you're having that negative growth. That's where it didn't fully recover. And that's where you're having this downward trend, right? So again, that's what that is. So what our system does is it plays into not only the growth. So if you have multiple days of growth, our algorithm takes in consideration the growth of the previous couple of days, but also the MDS numbers. So those numbers, how heavy was it contracting? So a lot of times you'll see, I've seen a couple of great examples recently where MDS was increasing and increasing and increasing. They went from yellow, then they went to orange. It was maybe 180 MDS. The temperature spiked the next day, but they applied water that same day. So they maintained the MDS at 180, and then that same day was 180. So they still were in a orange status, but since they applied water, they didn't go into that red status. So they were actually able to prevent that from going into a stressed environment. And if you saw yesterday or the day prior, you saw a lot of greens probably in your ranch. That was very indicative of the temperature, right? So the temperature dropped a few degrees. The trees did not have to work as hard. So you actually saw some of them jump from, an orange or something or a yellow status, and it went actually to the green without you guys actually even applying water. And that was because simply the temperature actually had dropped. So it's very, it very much plays off again the crop load, and also the temperature changes, the weather, the winds, stuff like that. If you guys notice windy days, you'll have a lot of potential stress on the trees as well. I think I answered that, Joseph. I don't know if you want to add a little bit more.
Yeah, I feel like that was a pretty solid answer. And Catherine, the one who asked it, if you're welcome to add into the chat if you would like a little more information on that. And I'll go back to what I just said too. Reach out to your CSM. If I recognize your name correctly, I believe that's Chris. I know he would probably be happy to go on about MDS and growth with you to make sure you really understand. Those are, for us, they're very important values, but they are distinctly different. They have their own uses and they have their own ways they need to be interpreted. Now, another good question I just saw come in is talking about when you might need to do a flood irrigation in a traditionally, micro drip sprinkler block to set the floor from mulching. Probably mulching a cover crop, I'm assuming. Dave, you're welcome to add any more information in there if you feel like it's necessary. What would be the best time to perform that flood to set the orchard floor?
Sure, when the trees are dormant, and the reason you want to do that too is because with micro irrigation too. So if you have double line drip, for example, most of the almond orchards are on berms as well. So what happens is you're pushing water here, but it ends up pushing the salts into the berm, right? So we actually, on our ranches, we would have one fan jet and two lines of drip. Well, that's what we started doing after we had Phytech. We initially had one fan jet, one line of drip, and we would use fan jet to irrigate all year long and drip during harvest. We completely changed that after we looked at Phytech. We went with watering drip all the time because it was much more effective at getting where we needed to be, spoon feeding the trees. And we used fan jet during that time frame in order to leach salt. So if you need to flood and for setting the floor, I would also do when it's dormant because it'd be twofold. You'd be setting the floor, you're saying, and then also you'd be leaching those salts out, before the season starts. So that's where I'd recommend doing that is that, micro irrigation is great, but the only drawback to that, especially with double line drip, is it tends to push salt in the middle, which over a period of time, especially this year, we're going to be using a lot of wells. That's going to make that situation worse. A lot of salt again that are going to be building up. So we didn't really get any rain this year. So hopefully we'll get rain, this next year to help leach those down. I think that answered it.
No, it did. But Dave actually had a good follow up though. Okay, and this is a good question. You can see dormancy good in Phytech. Oh my gosh, you needed to do that flood and you missed dormancy. The trees woke up last week, or they woke up 2 weeks ago. Okay, now you're having to do the mulching. Now you have to do that flood. What's your kind of second best go-to in terms of options?
Second best go-to. Well, I mean, if you have to do it, this is a thing. If you have to do it, you've got to do it. If you've got to mulch, if you've got to do this thing, then that's fine. I would sooner in the season rather than later. The reason I'd say that is because of that humidity issues that I was pointing out. So like we're starting to get higher temperatures, 90s next week and stuff like that, at least down here in the South Valley. So I would not be recommending anything that would be increasing humidity levels, especially right now. So I guess the sooner the better. So if I've missed it, they woke up. Okay, we'll just get it on as quickly as you can before it gets too late in the season.
No, that's exactly what I was thinking too, that getting that on as early as possible. And this is a funny year too. I was just looking at last April's data with a client yesterday, and I think we counted 5 or 6 days of rain last April. The highest it ever got was like 78, 77 degrees here in the Visalia area. Just a different world in comparison to where we are here in 2021, where it looks like we'll probably have no rain at all this month, and we're already, just like you said, Mark, getting up into the 90s. It's a very different situation, and so we're kind of in a constraint that I don't think we normally have. With that, I think Catherine had one last kind of follow up with the MDS versus growth. She was saying that she kind of notices that the peaks occur at 8 to 9 in the morning and the valleys at 5 to 6 in the afternoon. And does that correspond pretty closely to the beginning and the end of transpiration?
Yes, it does. Typically because, the sun's rising around 6 or so here, but when it gets to finally where it's starting that actual peak where it starts to actually transpire around 8, and then as the sun's setting, so you're having this, little, period of this early in the morning where it's not as high, and then in the afternoon where the sun is starting to set. So yeah, that correlates directly with the peak transpiration time. So during that period of time, if you guys can, I've always recommended, one of the cool things to do is if you have a couple of days of stress, apply water right in the middle of the day and see how your peak actually is affected compared to the last couple of days, because the tree no longer has to go so deep. It'll actually start to pull that water that you're giving it. But yes, it does translate to the transpiration of that tree.
That's great. Mark, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing all of this knowledge and with everyone here. Now, I wanted, as we kind of wrap things up, guys, to direct you over, if you have the opportunity or if you haven't had the chance to read it yet, to our second almond beet report. Now it's called the almond beet, but the ideas here are not just for almond farmers. There are some really great core concepts and ways in which you can further utilize Phytech elements to go even in different directions. We've talked a lot about plant physiology today, but specifically this almond beet is actually really after a pressure checkup and using the Phytech PSI heat maps and the PSI readings coming off your pressure sensors after every single irrigation to fully understand how your irrigation system is performing and get the best use of this. This year, even more than any other year in the past few, it is so critical to make every drop count. Every hour of power, every ounce of water needs to be used to its maximum efficiency. And that's really where this pressure monitoring can take your system that might be, it's a B minus, but, get it to that A plus for sure. So go and check that out on our website. Got a great report there at Almond Beat number 2 at the blog. And I will let Matan, if he has any final words to you guys. Otherwise, appreciate your time so much. Glad for everyone to be able to join us. I think this is some really good information.